Welcome to this special webinar. My name is Dr. Steven Sussman. I'm an Associate Professor of Public Administration and Associate Dean in the Andreas School of Business at Barry University in Miami, and the co-founder of the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research. Dr. Fleischman and I, along with a team of dedicated colleagues, established the center as an outlet for the marketplace of ideas. The Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is a nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center, and a think tank. We are a gathering of scholars, experts, and community stakeholders engaged in research and dialogue in an effort to create practical policy recommendations to current local, national, and international challenges. Therefore, the center encourages discussion and research from multiple perspectives. We believe that good policy is the result of reasonable dialogue and healthy debate. We believe in the marketplace of ideas. Thus, through publishing balanced articles and community engagement, the center aspires to provide a platform for critical thinking, analysis, and ideas to confront challenges that affect our world. So please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org. This webinar is co-sponsored with Florida Atlantic University's Political Science Department and the World Affairs Council of Palm Beach County. Dr. Robert Rabiel from FAU and Celeste Simon, the CEO of the World Affairs Council, are actively engaged in our center. Tonight's event is a very special event. Dr. Luis Fleischman recently published his new book, The Middle East Riddle, a study of the Middle East peace process and Israeli-Arab relations in changing times. As I previously noted, Dr. Fleischman is co-founder of the center. As such, it is fitting that his book tour begins at home, here at the center. Using Professor Fleischman's book as a backdrop, Professor Robert Rabiel, a distinguished expert in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Professor Fleischman will provide an analysis of the Middle East peace process. At the conclusion of their discussion, Dr. Yosef Olmert, adjunct professor of political science at the University of South Carolina and a Middle East expert, will comment and ask the first question. We will then open the floor for your questions. To ask a question, you can write your question in the chat box, or you can also email me at shim613@gmail.com. That's shim613@gmail.com. With that, I now turn it over to Professor Rabiel.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, it is a pleasure and honor to be with you this afternoon. And let me tell you this, I am very happy that I was called upon, to speak and comment and ask questions about the book of Dr. Luis Fleischman, whom I consider a very good friend. I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the background, the context, against which Luis wrote this book. And then I will ask, a few questions, mainly about the main arguments imparted by Luis in the book. Luis, as others, including me, we were hopeful, that the Arab-Israeli conflict is going to be resolved. I still look back when I was a student, in the 1990s, I was happy to see that the Israeli as Arabs are meeting around one table. I was happy as Luis, and hopeful to see that the Oslo Accord were signed. And let me tell you this, as someone who served in Lebanon as the chief of emergency of the Red Cross during the Civil War, when I saw Rabin and Arafat, shake their hands, I felt that the world turned upside down for me, really. It was such an event. I said, my God, is this happening? And then what happened, despite certain blows to the peace process, and the assassination of late Prime Minister Rabin, Mr. Security of Israel, and most importantly, the terrorist attacks, carried out by Hamas, in Israel, 1994, 1995, 1996, terrible. Still, Israel pursued peace with the Palestinians. And then you had, more than one plan. And I would speak about especially the Israeli plan, the Barak peace plan, and the Olmert peace plan. And I think myself, looking at those plans, they were fair, straightforward. They would have given the Palestinians over 95% of the territories. They could have swapped land. Jerusalem could have been mainly shared. It was a lot. And then what happened? There was no counter offer. You have the Palestinian Intifada, 2000, 2005. And then really there was a failure to produce a counter offer, a failure to go ahead and resume the negotiation. And this is where Lewis comes in. Lewis comes in and he takes a look and he say, why? He asks the question, why, the negotiation failed? Why the bilateral negotiation failed? Why the multilateral negotiation that the Arabs were part in again failed? What happened? You have, of course, the mediation of the US, the mediation of other countries. And what happened? Why? Now, of course, something about Lewis, what he did, he listed, mainly he quoted many experts from Asher Saucer to Berlin to others and others. Why? Those scholars gave their views, why the peace process failed and so far failed. And then, although you have a lot of issues, you have the border issue, you have the Jerusalem issue, you have other issues as well. Two main issues when I look at them, I see them everywhere and I see them at the center of those conflicts, those issues, mainly the right of return and the settlement. So here again, Lewis, asked himself this question and he said, listen, there is something here. I want to take a sociological view, a sociological, approach to understanding why the Palestinian failed to pursue peace with Israel. And he came after such an analysis to see that, the Palestinians, they were very much factionalized. Their society or the PA society or the PA leadership is fragmented. You have a lot of mobilization there that militated against taking a decisive decision toward peace. And then he looked into, the failure. He looked into the legitimacy or the lack of the legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership. He looked into the effect of the anti-Israel propaganda that affected this generation and a future generation, and he looked into the multilateral Arab, track where they were at first engaged and then not engaged, and now they are more engaged. Although I wouldn't say in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And then, he spoke about two solutions, mainly, regarding the West Bank and regarding Gaza. Now, this is the context, and I'm going to start with my first questions. Mainly, Dr. Fleischman, in your book, you claim that Oslo failed because the Palestinian leadership was not interested in independent state under current circumstances. This is a big statement. As a matter of fact, is a very serious statement and weighty statement when you say that the Palestinian leadership is not interested in independent state. Given that, what we hear, what we see, is that the leadership has worked so much and spoke so much, and from their perspective, they did so much, sacrificed so much for self-determination. Can you please elaborate on this important statement?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you so much for your wonderful summary. It is a very good beginning, and I'm glad, for your careful reading of the book. Before I answer your question, I would like to recognize a few people here. First of all, John Barron and Judy Ellman, thank you so much for enabling me to complete this book. Their help was crucial. Dr. Ross Gatens from FAU for editing the book. I also want to thank Professor Ken Stein, Dr. Ken Stein from Emory University. Not anymore, I think he retired from Emory University, but he's the head of the Center for Israel Education. I did some translations for him and I learned tremendously from him, and he also recommended me some literature. So I want to recognize, I thank all of them for being here. And finally, I want to recognize Ambassador Michael Skoll, former Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, for being here. Now I want to ask to answer your question, which is, why do I claim that the negotiations failed simply because the Palestinian leadership was not interested in an independent state? Yes, indeed, it's true. As you pointed out, Robert, my analysis is mostly sociological. That means I don't look at what they say. I don't look at what they say during the negotiations. I don't make an analysis based on what they openly say or what the diplomats actually said, although I use the diplomats to show that indeed Israel conceded on a number of times to the Palestinians and what was really on the table and what was rejected. That is correct. However, I was intrigued by the fact that the Palestinian leadership rejected every reasonable offer and compromise with Israel, including the division of Jerusalem. And Robert, you said more than 90% of the West Bank, all of Gaza. Yes, the Clinton parameters even went as far as offering 99% of the West Bank that the Israelis initially accepted, the Palestinians didn't. Taba collapsed. So, and instead, as you pointed out, they demanded concessions like control over the entire Temple Mount, not only half of Jerusalem, but also control of the entire Temple Mount. And it didn't make sense to me that the Palestinians really thought that they would be able to either obtain these concessions or worse, let's say, destroy the state of Israel by having the Israelis accepting the right of return. That, I don't think the Palestinians were that stupid as to believe that the Israelis would agree to something like that. I believe that what they received, particularly with the Clinton parameters and with the Olmert concessions, is the most they could get if they wanted a Palestinian state. Now, what was the point in rejecting it? Well, the point in rejecting it is the following. The Palestinian leadership under Arafat, the PLO, they remember after 1982, they went on they were exiled in Tunisia, right? Meanwhile, the first Intifada that took place between 1988 and 1992 took place without the leadership of the PLO. The PLO had absolutely nothing to do with that. Even though the Israelis eventually sent sent the troops to kill Abu Jihad, the PLO had nothing to do with the first Intifada. The first Intifada was a social movement, was autonomous, and it engaged an entire new generation and the trade unions and the other associations. And it was during that time that Hamas was formed as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. That means that when Arafat actually enters the West Bank and Gaza again in 1994, one of the reasons why he returns is because he wanted to regain control over the Palestinian territories. Control that they knew that they somehow lost it because they actually had no control of the first Intifada or the new organizations that actually began to form there. Now, I am not saying, and I'm not blaming the PLO, and I'm not saying that they actually had ill intentions. After all, engaging in Oslo, in the Oslo process, and shaking the hands of Rabin in front of the Muslim world, in front of the Arab world, in front of the Palestinians, dissident Palestinians, was a courageous step after all. Okay, I saw it then as a courageous step. The problem is that when they returned, but the PLO actually returned to the West Bank, it was too late for the PLO to gain control over the Palestinian population. That means at this point, you already have alternative sovereignty to the Palestinian Authority by groups such as Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, and also by a general crisis of legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority. The PLO was seen as an aloof type of elite and corrupt. Making a sociological analysis, it occurs to me that that is the main reason why the Palestinian leadership actually rejected the creation of a Palestinian state, because they knew that once an independent Palestinian state was created, they would be gone. It would collapse under the power of the alternative forces and under a crisis of legitimacy, if you wish. In fact, the 2007 coup d'etat by Hamas confirms that, okay? Confirms that the Palestinian Authority, or Fatah, couldn't do anything when Hamas actually overthrew them in Gaza in 2007. So that means Hamas has grown as a meaningful alternative power that defined the sovereignty of the PLO, and the PLO, Arafat sensed that, and also Abbas sensed that they would not last long if an independent Palestinian state were to be created. On the other hand, particularly after the coup d'etat that deposed the PLO from Gaza, there was stronger security cooperation between Israel and the PLO and Fatah, and of course, more aid coming from foreign aid, right? Coming from abroad. That means that for the Palestinian leadership, it was much more convenient to maintain the status quo of not having a Palestinian state, of being in a situation of occupation, and I say quote unquote, because that security with Israel would be good for Israel on the one hand, for its security, but on the other hand, would be good to maintain the rule of Fatah over the Palestinians. And therefore, they prefer the status quo, at least for the time being. They weren't ready for a independent Palestinian state. And that's the main reason why they rejected it. I don't believe that there were bad intentions initially at the beginning of the signing of Oslo. I don't believe that the Palestinians had any illusion that they could destroy Israel or force Israel to accept the return of 3 million Palestinian refugees and descendants. I believe that's the reason why they destroyed they rejected every possible reasonable offer that was made either by the Israelis or the Americans.
Okay, thank you, Louis. Now, in another chapter also, you made some very important point that the Palestinian has been in a state of mobilization, a state of a revolution, and a state of conflict, which really militated against them taking risks for peace. So I really would like you to speak about that, but also I would like you to add something on the Israeli side when you speak about the mobilization and the forces against peace. The assassination of Rabin, although I would say myself that Hamas and the Palestinian terror really demolished, the left and the center left, you still have, I would say, right and far right in Israel. Really, you see them, Naftali and other, and before that, they are not interested in peace, period. So first, can you give us, some elaboration on what do you mean by that state of permanent mobilization and revolution and its impact? And a little bit again, just to put it in perspective on Israel again, if you see it as a mobilization against peace as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Yes, I analyzed, and by the way, I have to admit, Robert, that that particular chapter, which is chapter 2, was influenced a lot by your work, particularly your work on Salafist in Lebanon. And as you can see, I quote you widely there because this is a very crucial point. The first time I wrote about this was in 2009. It was an article that I wrote for the Jewish Policy Center. The Palestinians have lived on mobilization, all right, particularly after 1967. After 1967, if you recall, there was the Battle of Karami, right?
Yes.
Which in fact, the Battle of Karami was an attempt by the Palestinians and the Jordanians to reject an Israeli military incursion against, after a terrorist attack. The reality is that there were more Palestinians and Jordanians who were killed during that battle than Israelis. But for some reason, the Palestinians sold this to their people and as a public relations campaign as a victory. And so they believed at that point that the Palestinians were capable of doing what all the Arab states were unable to do, which was to destroy Israel, right? To defeat Israel in a war. They said, we defeated Israel at Karami. And then they were so emboldened that a group or a sector of the PLO, of course, tried to overthrow King Hussein in 1970, shortly, a couple of years after Karami. And we know the result, right? The PLO was expelled. They had a good number of people who were killed. And then the Palestinians actually moved to Lebanon, although they were already there since 1969, but the entire PLO basically moved its operations to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, as you recall, the Palestinian militias emerged as an important armed force, right?
Right.
Particularly in Beirut, they totally dominated West Beirut and dominated the refugee camps, right?
Yeah, and the Muslim camp too, the national movement. Correct.
What are you saying?
And they dominated the national movement, the camp against the Christian.
That is correct. That is correct. And that is very clear in your book as well. They dominated the Palestinian refugee camps. They dominated West Beirut. They clashed with the Lebanese army. And eventually, they joined the fight of the Muslims against the Christians. They basically broke their neutrality. Part of it, I think they were absolutely emboldened. There was a Palestinian euphoria that has been going on for a long time. And it was also during that time that they carried out all these famous terrorist attacks. If you recall, the attack on Kiryat Shmona, the then called Lod Airport, now it's called Kurion Airport, where 17 Puerto Ricans were killed, among others. The attack on Maalot, the attack on the Coastal Road, several terrorist attacks that were carried out then by the PLO. But they also, their sense of involvement and victory actually was also confirmed by their political victories. For instance, in the 1970s, they were able to secure observer status at the United Nations. And they were able to even pass a major resolution that delegitimized Israel altogether, the famous resolution equating Zionism with racism. And so, in other words, after Israel's war in Lebanon, I already mentioned that, the Palestinians moved to Tunisia. Then we have the first Intifada. And then you have the emergence of Hamas that actually introduces a new element to mobilize the Palestinians. And that's the element of Islamism. Islamism began to make grounds, partly, of course, in the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza, as we know, but also in the different refugee camps. where there was the idea of Islamism, you know, in the way of Hamas was spread out, and Palestinians were indoctrinated. Now, it is no wonder that we have so many Palestinians playing roles in non-Palestinians jihadist movements. And I'll give you an example. Abdallah Hassan, if you recall, was a mentor to Bin Laden. Remember, he got killed.
I remember very, very well.
Abdallah Hassan, right. Then you have Palestinians also played a role in the Islamic Jihad groups in Egypt, Jordan, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and even in Chechnya, there were Palestinians. You know, the head of Al-Qaeda in Europe is originally a Palestinian from Bethlehem and Nablus, right? His name was, I believe, Abu Qatada or something like that.
Abu
I need to
Qatada.
remember, I need to look at it. I think it's Abu Qatada. I need to look
Abu
back.
Qatada.
Yeah, Abu Qatada, right.
Abu Qatada.
Then you have another Palestinian, I believe his name is Al-Maqdisi, who was the mentor of Al-Zarqawi, the person who was the head of the Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, if you recall, was eventually killed by American troops. So, and according to King Abdullah of Jordan, if I recall, they claim that almost 100% of the attacks conducted by ISIS in Jordan were perpetrated by Palestinians. So this is not coincidental. This is the result of the fact that the Palestinians are the most mobilized group in the Middle East among the Arabs. They themselves are in a constant state of revolution, in a constant state of permanent revolution, and in a constant state of mobilization. For instance, the Second Intifada, all right, which is basically the first sign that the Palestinians had no control at all. I'm sorry, that the PLO or Fatah had no control at all, right? Although some people say that Arafat started it, today I bring in my book evidence that Arafat didn't start it. Arafat was carried away. He tried to claim credit for the Intifada, but in fact, he didn't start it. But what is interesting is that the Intifada was the result of a conflict between generations, right? It was not only Hamas and the Islamic Jihad that were involved in the Second Intifada, it was the Tanzim and some of the guards that were part of the PLO. Marwan Barghouti, right? Marwan Barghouti was the head of the Tanzim, was as responsible as Hamas for the Second Intifada, and he definitely believed in violence. And you can see from his writings, from his statements, he believed in violence. He believed that the only way to victory or to get what the Palestinians want is through violence. And that is the result of this tradition of Palestinian mobilization. Now let me answer now your question, which is about the Israeli side. I agree with you, Robert, that what killed the Israeli left, namely the peace camp, if you wish, is basically the disappointment with the peace process, is the disappointment with the Palestinians and with the Palestinian leadership, right? The failure of people like Yossi Beilin and everyone else, and even the people that actually signed the Geneva Accords, if you recall, which was a kind of fictional type of accord, an informal accord to show that the peace between Israelis and Palestinians can take place. Today, the left lost a lot of power precisely because of the actions of the Palestinians. And I want to say that the killing of Rabin, and I remember I flew to Israel to exercise my right as a citizen of Israel to vote for Shimon Peres in order to provide support for the peace process. And eventually, that was in '96, Netanyahu won, and Netanyahu won because many Israelis were disappointed. But then in 1999, when the Israelis again saw a hope to reach an agreement with the Palestinians, they voted for Ehud Barak. And the Ehud Barak went as far as to basically offer all the concessions that we already described. Now, if you ask me, I think the Israeli right is stronger. And frankly, I know there will be elections on March 23rd. I don't see a government of the center being built. I still see the a right-wing coalition winning, unfortunately. However, having said so, all right, and the settlements, I agree with you, Robert. The settlers are very much mobilized people. You know, they want to settle, they want to build, they want to expand the settlements, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, I believe that if the Israelis see the possibility of reaching an agreement with the Palestinians, the settlers would be automatically weakened, or any settlement that would bring about peace. I believe the majority of Israelis do not support the settlements, and I still believe that the settlements are not the primary problem, right? You still, and if you look at the writings of David Makovsky, he says, I mean, it's not that the possibility of building a Palestinian state is over because of the settlements. You can still build a Palestinian state, and the fact is that settlements have not expanded to the point of making a Palestinian state irreversible. So I believe that if there is a change, or the Israelis see a hope for a Palestinian state, the right wing will be weakened immediately. I don't know how it will be, but maybe enough for the center-left to win elections.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Louis. Now, in another chapter, you mentioned about the Arab states, and then that they were not much helpful in the Palestinian-Israeli process. Also, they were engaged in the multilateral track. And then you go ahead and you mentioned mainly recently what happened, the development in the region. Now more you have more contacts between Israelis and Arabs, especially in the Gulf, more ever than before. And then you speak about a certain role for the Arab world. As a matter of fact, when you said, listen, I have to go beyond the bilateral negotiation, you looked at the Arab world as a pillar for a future, possible peace between the Israelis or the Arabs, mainly that they could play a key role in that. Now, I would like you to speak about that, but also I would like you to add something about the Beirut Peace Summit, where the Saudi King Abdullah then, he said, listen, we are ready all as Arab countries to sign peace with Israel, normalize with Israel, if we have, land for peace and other issues that to be agreed upon. Can you really go ahead and elaborate on that, please, Louis?
When you mean the Beirut Summit, you mean the Arab Peace Initiative?
The Arab Peace Initiative, yes.
Yes.
Which took place in Beirut, and King Abdullah was behind it.
That is correct, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, and then that is correct. Now, first of all, why do I turn to the Arab world? And you are absolutely right. First of all, because I believe that the Palestinians are not at this point capable of signing a peace agreement with Israel for the reasons that I already explained. But there is more to it. The Palestinians at this point are poisoned by propaganda, and much of the propaganda is spread by the Palestinian Authority itself. And why they spread that propaganda? In order to appease those dissident forces that I mentioned before, like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the young generation that is against the Palestinians, right? They believe that by spreading anti-Israel propaganda, they are going to gain more legitimacy, or they are going to be better regarded by the population. So I clearly say that there is no possibility to reach an agreement with the Palestinian leadership or to reach an agreement with the Palestinian people. But on the other hand, that state of mobilization of the Palestinians is also not good for the Palestinians themselves, because they cannot go about, they are in such a state of mobilization and conflict that they cannot go about a normal life. So what I argue is that a solution needs to include two things: security and peace, right, for everyone, and at the same time, the possibility of normalizing life to the Palestinians so that they can go on into their private lives and conduct a normal life and, let's say, put the conflict aside. The conflict has defined the life of the Palestinians, and that is probably one of the worst consequences of what I say the state of permanent mobilization of the Palestinians, or permanent revolution. Now here we have the Arab states, and I introduced the Arab states. Historically, the Israeli-Arab conflict has been an Israeli-Arab conflict, not just a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Why there was war between the Arabs and the Israelis? And I actually give three reasons. The first, there was no tolerance for Jewish sovereignty in the Middle East. The Arabs claim that the Middle East belongs to the Arabs, or the Muslims, if you wish, something that was reinforced later by Nasser, of course, with Pan-Arabism, and the idea that Israel is basically a strange, or is a foreign element in the Middle East, and as a result, it shouldn't exist. Then you have the element of Israel being an external enemy that serves not only to unify the Arabs in general, right? Divided Arabs unified in their hostility to Israel, but also they serve as a tool to preserve the legitimacy of governments that are not legitimate in the first place. Governments such as the Iraqi one, or the Syrian one, even the revolutionary governments. I think Nasser was legitimate for a while. Mubarak, I don't think so. But in any event, so Israel would serve as the external enemy through which not only Arab states unified around, but also the people, right? So it was a means to reinforce or to strengthen a legitimacy that didn't exist. And of course, there was another element for Arab resentment against Israel, and that was precisely what I said, resentment. You know, the problem of honor. Having been defeated in 1948 and having been defeated in 1967, right? To a certain extent, I think there were sectors in the Arab world that interpreted peace with Israel as capitulation, as the continuation of the defeat in 1967. And even the 1973 war, the October War, the Yom Kippur War, was not enough to recover the sense of humiliation of the Arab people in general. Now, Sadat sold the Yom Kippur War as a sign or a symbol of the recovery of Arab honor. And that enabled him to make peace with Israel a few years later. But the reality is that under Mubarak, and particularly under Mubarak, this person that after he was deposed, you know, some people in Israel miss him, thinking that what is coming next is even worse. Hosni Mubarak was the person that basically prevented any deepening of contacts between Egyptians and Israeli civilians or institutions. Even Egyptians who actually visited Israel, they were punished. They were put in jail, or they were arrested, or their homes were raided, and so on and so forth. This is why I agree with Professor Ken Stein when he says that the peace between Israelis and the peace between Israel and Egypt, in fact, is looks like another interim agreement, you know, almost like separation of forces, yes, something like that, another interim agreement, an extension of the agreements that were signed in the mid-70s. Now, this sense of humiliation, in my opinion, prevails even during Oslo. In Oslo, the Arab states were supposed to actually give backing to the Oslo process. They created the multilateral talks where they were supposed to discuss their regional issues, water issues, energy issues, all kinds of issues in order to basically guarantee the peace. And that involved a number of Arab countries. Egypt is the first country to withdraw from the multilateral talks. And why did they withdraw from the multilateral talks? Because they were afraid of the vision of Shimon Peres that talked about integration between Israel and the Arab countries. Because they were afraid that Israel would become the dominant power in the region, and as a result, it would be the leader of the Arab world, given its technological superiority. All right? So there was a sort of resentment on the part of the Arabs, and I think when some analysts actually claim, and I think Fouad Ajami, number one, who, you know, the late Fouad Ajami, may his memory be blessed, who said basically the Arabs welcomed the election of Netanyahu in 1996 because they were afraid of peace. To a certain extent, knowing the psychology or studying the psychology of the Arab world, I think I agree with Ajami. Now, and what happened is that after Arafat rejected the proposals of Ehud Barak and the proposals of the Clinton parameters, Clinton actually appeals to the Arab states to intervene and to persuade Arafat to accept the proposals and to sign a peace agreement. And basically, most Arab countries actually refused to come forward with the exception of Jordan and Morocco, or Jordan and Tunisia. I forgot, Jordan was one, I forgot whether Morocco or Tunisia is in my book. So that confirms that Arab states actually see peace with Israel as a form of capitulation. Now, all of a sudden, things began to change. And here in the last couple of years, we are seeing changes, right? All of a sudden, you know, Iran actually turns as a new threat, and a new threat from the Sunni Arab countries, particularly in the Gulf, right? And the Iranian threat basically brings Israel and the Arabs together. Why? Particularly after the signing of a deal, of the Iran deal, that Obama and the 5 powers of the Security Council actually signed with Iran. It was in an interview that Obama gave to Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, when he basically said that the Saudis needed to learn how to share the region, and he basically insinuated that they should share the region with Iran. That basically gave the Saudis the sense that the Americans were abandoning them. And this is how basically we are seeing a new coalition or a new closeness between Israel and Gulf states, and not only Gulf states, also some North African countries. What is interesting is that we are having the Abraham Accords, that means normalization of relations with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, with the tacit support of Saudi Arabia, something that would have been inconceivable 10 years ago, or maybe less. And there is also normalization of relations with countries such as Sudan, right? And Morocco. Morocco has always been a more or less normal relation, but Sudan definitely not. Now, I still argue that the advantage that these relations have is that the Palestinians may be feeling more isolated. And the other advantage that that has is that the Israelis can talk more directly to the Arabs about solving the Palestinian issue. Because I claim that it doesn't matter, the fact that there is a process of normalization between the Israelis and the Arabs does not mean that the Palestinian problem is going away, particularly as long as Israel actually holds on these territories, holds on the West Bank. Therefore, Israel needs to take advantage of this normalization of relations with Arab states in order to push for a solution of the Palestinian problem with the help of the Arabs. And of course, I provide what I think it should happen. But at this point, I think that's the you know, in other words, if the Israelis ignore the Palestinian issues and they actually focus only on the normalization with the Arabs, I think is going to be a mistake. And on the other hand, the Arabs need to be part of the solution of the Palestinian problem.
Thank you, Lewis. Now, listen, given the constraint of time, I'm going to ask you the last question based on the book, but it will have, you know, a couple of more branches in it. You know, you spoke about the Arab Spring, and you spoke about that the Arab Spring has created new dynamics in Arab society. And you spoke again, you know, the Arab Spring, or the people that they are involved in the Arab Spring, they could play a role or help peace in the region. This is something I would like you to elaborate on. The second, as a matter of fact, I feel affiliated with that, is that the Arab Spring failed. And I look at Egypt today. Egypt, you have no idea what's going on, you know, really. And as a matter of fact, yesterday or before yesterday, I read the bicameral letters that was sent by Congress, by 56 members of the US Congress, sorry, to Sisi. Really, they kind of really criticize him for his human rights abuses. So mainly my point is, when you speak about the Arab Spring, I see that probably in the Arab Gulf, you have a little bit move, given more leeway, especially in Saudi Arabia. But in other places, I see that the Arabs today, especially in the most populous, you know, state in Egypt, I see that they are now today in a more difficult position than before. And finally, and this is where really I want your opinion, because I want to share with you this really. I always had deep doubts about solutions, and one solution, especially the confederation between Jordan and the West Bank. After I read your chapter and after I read your comments, after, of course, you cited Musaiba, you cited others, and I was thinking about it more and more. As a matter of fact, the last 2 days I've been thinking about it. And really, although I was against it not too long ago, recently, yesterday or before yesterday, I started to think it could be really, you know, if the Arab world are there, if United States comes in, you know, if Jordan, especially as you mentioned, has been really persuaded to take that role, it could really lead to some kind of a solution. Because listen, in a confederation, what you have a union of sovereign state stressing autonomy. So they could be apart, but mainly the king will be the one, you know, who is the at the head of the pyramid. So I would like you to go ahead and elaborate on this interconnected issues, the Arab Spring role, and then the possibility of peace, you know, in a form of a confederation between Jordan and the Palestinian and the West Bank and Gaza.
Yes, well, thank you so much for the questions. I mean, I appreciate it. First of all, Robert, you know, good friends can disagree. And you said that the Arab Spring is a failure.
I said it failed, not a failure. It failed. Right. Yeah, it failed.
It has failed. That's why it looks like that.
Mainly, they suppressed it. This is why it failed. It wasn't a failure by itself and in itself. It was failed on account of suppression and oppression. You know,
well, that is correct, and for the time being. But I like, since I am a sociologist, I like to make comparisons, and I relate to the Arabs in the same way that I relate to any region in the world. All right. And if you look at the processes of democratization, let's say in Europe, okay, you had the French Revolution in 1789, right? It was a major event, okay? But the French Revolution led to a bloody dictatorship, right? By the Commission of Public Safety, Robespierre, Danton, Marat, all these people, right? People were executed. In fact, you have 50 or 60 years later, in 1848, you have what is called the European Spring, correct? Which is basically, obviously, 60 years later, people did not achieve what they needed to achieve, you know? all the rights that they needed to achieve, and certainly not the civil or the political rights. And of course, in France itself, you basically have some sort of democracy close to the end of the 19th century, okay? I would say the first democratic probably leader in France was Clemenceau, right? The same who actually conducted World War I. Yes. Now, therefore, I see the Arab Spring as an unfinished project, as a development that still goes on, all right? Even when you mention Egypt, you know, it's interesting because I interviewed a number of Arabs through Zoom. Thank God for Zoom that I can talk to Arabs, which is great, okay? And I'm very thankful to those who actually agreed. And it's very interesting because it's true that Sisi is extremely oppressive. But remember, Sisi actually takes over after there were demonstrations against the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood. And people basically rejected the totalitarian, if you wish, proposal of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? The authoritarian, you know, the religious, theocratic proposal of the Muslim Brotherhood. In other words, before Sisi took over Egypt, there were already demonstrations by the secular political parties and by the people, all right? In other words, what brought the people to the streets in 2011 brought them again in 2013, and of course, you had a situation of Bonapartism where actually Sisi takes over in order to restore chaos. And when I talk to people, Egyptians, they say that the Egyptians actually look at what's going on in Libya and in Syria, and they say we'd rather have a dictatorship than having this chaotic situation. Very interesting. And that's not uncommon, right? That reminded me a lot of the coup d'etat in Chile, that the reason why so many people supported Pinochet was precisely because Pinochet was restoring some sort of order in a situation of almost civil war. But where I see the achievements of the Arab Spring is not necessarily on the current successes here and there. I see the importance of the Arab Spring is that people in civil society, what is called, they lost fear. That means they lost the fear that they used to have of these dictatorships, all right? And so they went to the streets. To tell you the truth, it shocked me when people actually went to the streets in Syria. Syria is known for being a highly repressive regime, ruthless, cruel, and people still went out to the streets. So there is loss of fear, and this loss of fear, there is an awakening. And people begin to question the premises on what they have been educated and indoctrinated all their lives. First of all, they finally come to terms in a sort of political Freudianism, if you wish, with the situation of the Arab governments. That means they know that the cause of their troubles and their miseries is basically bad government. And who is responsible? Not Israel, but the government, the Arab government. So we are seeing changes. These changes are slow. I'm not saying that overnight people all of a sudden love Israel and they hate the governments and that's the end of story. We are seeing a very slow process. There is an awakening. And we are seeing more awareness that the enemy is not external, but the enemy is the problem is internal. People are making more demands, right? Even in countries such as Iran, which is not an Arab country, we have seen people protesting and demanding that less resources be channeled to Hezbollah or the Houthis or against Israel or to Gaza, and that there should be more resources channeled for domestic improvement. We are seeing changes in the kind of discourse, what people talk in their own homes or in the salons, right? There is Jürgen. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I moved something at the go. We are, I'm sorry. We are still here. This I am influenced by Jürgen Habermas, who is a German philosopher and sociologist. social scientist. He introduced the concept of the public sphere. And he talks about the public sphere as a transition where basically the idea of liberty and freedom begins at home. People actually begin to change the discourse and the kind of conversations. There was a time that even in their homes, they wouldn't speak openly about anything. And now they begin to speak about different things. And we are, and including, there are some who are challenging the relation to Israel and the whole concept of Israel. We are seeing more and more intellectuals, Arab scholars that have visited Israel. We are seeing different writings that are appearing on the newspapers that are questioning also. I spoke to Nadim Shahid, who is a Lebanese scholar in the Chatham Institute in England. I spoke to several people like Abdullah Silva, who is the head of the Center for Israel Studies in Jordan. And they are all, and I spoke to several people who live in Yemen, and they all told me that at this point, people are being much more aware that they need to question the premises upon which they have been educated all these years and all these decades. So it's not something that is going to happen overnight, but I believe it's a process that has taken off somehow. And I believe that the Palestinian cause is going to be more and more, people are in the Arab world are so much focused on their domestic needs and in questioning the premises upon which they have been educated, that I believe that could be helpful in the long run to improve relations between the Arabs and the Israelis. This is why I also called not to let only the Arab governments to deal with the Israeli government, but also engage in what is called civil society encounters. And I view the role of academics and individuals and intellectuals as crucial to enhance or to strengthen that relation and eliminate stereotypes or prejudices between Arabs and Israelis. Now, then you have a second question, Robert, and that is the issue of the Jordanian-Palestinian Confederacy. Now, the reason why I support a Palestinian-Jordanian Confederacy is because I believe exactly what you said. You know, the king would be Abdullah, right, the Hashemite, and then you will have an autonomous Jordan and an autonomous Palestinian entity. There will be freedom of movement between them. And then I believe that, first of all, there are connections between Palestinian Jordanians and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So that means it will be easier to basically create what I call an entity where they can coexist. Secondly, it could be good for Jordan, because Jordan has, and this is an idea that I borrowed from Benny Morris, because Jordan has basically large portions of land and territory that are not populated and need to be developed. And I believe that adding the Palestinian population could be helpful. I also believe that the Jordanian security forces have the ability to exercise control on Hamas. I know that that may not sound very human, right? Because of the issues of, human rights, but I believe that Hamas, and that has been shown by the fear that Hamas has displayed toward Egypt, for instance, even after the deposal of the Muslim Brotherhood, you can see that Hamas is so afraid of al-Sisi. Hamas is not that afraid of the Israelis as it is afraid of strong Arab states, because they know that Arab states don't take prisoners. So I believe, and I think what the Jordanians are afraid of absorbing more Palestinians, and I realize that it will be difficult to persuade the Jordanians to agree to something like that. But on the other hand, they need to remember that they effectively removed the PLO from Jordan in 1970, when the PLO actually rebelled against or tried to depose King Hussein. So
Very
I
good.
believe that the Jordanians actually have the ability to control dissident forces among the Palestinians and impose order and return normalcy to the Palestinians. And
Louis,
by the way, yes,
on account of the constraints of time,
yes,
you gave me a very sufficient answer, and thank you for much. Now, before I give the floor to Yossi, just I want to say something. Your book is well argued, well researched, and well written. Mazal tov, my friend. Okay, Mazal tov. Yossi, the floor.
I was
Yossi,
afraid
the
of your
floor
opinion,
is yours.
I told you.
Yossi, you're muted. You're muted, Yossi.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's almost like time to say Shabbat Shalom, so I would preempt it and say it already. Because of the time constraints and the need of the participants to ask the questions, I'll make very quick comments and give up on a question, but I will leave you with an idea that might lead to other questions. The first comment is, and it's not necessarily the most important part of what was in the discussion, is that I take issue with everything that has to do with the idea that Israeli politics are determined mostly by the Palestinian issue, or that the change in Israel had mostly to do with the Palestinian issue. I doubt it very much. I disagree with it, as a matter of fact. The fact of the matter is that there are identities, collective identities in Israel, and they show themselves in elections. And the fact that the so-called right-wing coalition, the Likud coalition, is mostly of people from Arab countries, used to be more so among the Russians, less so now, religious people and all that, has to do with the Palestinian issue up to a point. It has to do with other Israeli developments, and therefore the collapse of the left wing in Israel, which we show in these elections when nobody talks about the Palestinian issue. Even the Meretz party is kind of shying away from that. It shows to me that we have other issues in place here, but I don't want to get too much into that, because in a few days there will be elections in Israel, and you might say on the night of Tuesday, what is he talking about? See the results. So let's leave that aside. But about the main theme of the discussion here, I would like to make three very quick comments, and maybe one or two of them may be by way of presenting a different vision, perhaps. And one of them will be, why do we always say that Oslo failed, period? Oslo opened the door to a new type of Israeli-Palestinian situation, something that was unthinkable before. And sometimes when you want to look at a situation like that, don't listen to sociologists as brilliant as Louis is, or pretentious Middle East experts as I am, or real one as Robert is. Look, say, at the world of art, for example. Look even at the series Fauda, and remember how the head of Palestinian Internal Security was talking to his son about the Israelis, and what did he do in cooperation with the Israelis to maintain law and order and security in the territories as well as in Israel. Something that we couldn't even think about before Oslo. And all the other levels of cooperation that, in a way, I would say Oslo opened the door to a more normalized conflict. In many respects, this conflict was abnormal. In many respects, it became more normalized. And that leads me to the other question, and this is, what is the solution to the problem? How do we define a real solution to the Israeli-Palestinian situation? If Ken Stein, a good old friend of us all, thinks that the Israeli-Egyptian peace is an interim arrangement, and he might be right about that, what do we expect, therefore, from what we would call a peace solution with the Palestinians? We also need to understand that there are different types of solutions to conflicts, because there are different types of conflicts. And I would argue, therefore, that we need to think in terms of solutions, not just one solution, all kinds of levels of solving problems that are outstanding without coming to the overall outstanding conclusion of the conflict with a nice ceremony in which everybody says that this is it. That is not going to happen for a long time to come. The third point that I would like to make here is coming to the Arab Spring and all that before and after. Here is the point. The point is that, again, we need to ask ourselves a question: what really is the precursor to events like the Arab Spring, the changes in attitudes of Arab countries towards Israel, the Abraham Accords and all that? And I would go again to the late 70s, early 80s, the rise of Iran, but not just from the perspective of them attacking other Arab countries. It is because the rise of the Islamic Revolution in Iran created a new agenda for politics in the Middle East and led Arab countries to understand, at least leaderships, I should say, that their interests lie differently than what they used to be before, because they really look at one element, and one element in particular as being the most important for them. What is the one thing that endangers most their survivability in their own countries? And they came to the conclusion, I think, that the Arab-Israeli conflict is not the one that really threatens their survivability. And if that's the case, it would have led to a rethinking about, in that case, let's try to do something with Israelis. I mean, that's not the issue that really is putting in danger our very existence. So why do I say all that? I say all that because what we need to bear in mind, and here I'm in total agreement with Luis and I believe with Robert, we cannot say, and Netanyahu says it for his own political reasons, I understand that. We cannot say that this is the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict as we have known it. This is the end of a stage in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but the conflict is still continuing because changes in the outlook of Arab regimes as to what would be the danger to them would lead possibly to another change of attitude towards Israel. It could. So we have to bear in mind that. My last very point would be the following. The Israeli-Palestinian segment of the conflict is becoming more and more a domestic Israeli issue. It's not in the elections now. It wasn't in the elections of the last 3-4 campaigns, but something is emerging in Israel now that can be very positive. It could be very negative. It's a question of how we look at it. The change of attitude of Israeli Arabs to the problem of the Palestinians, and the fact that more and more Israeli Arabs want to get more and more incorporated within the Israeli political system. I think that we may see the same situation with more and more Palestinians who might get desperate about the idea that there cannot be the desired solution of no Israel or whatever independent Palestinian state, and would like to have different and other types of cooperation with Israel, which will become more and more of a domestic Israeli problem. We need to look at it as a possibility for the near future, the foreseeable future, even though it is still not the main theme of the current campaigns in Israel. But the fact that there is one Arab party, which is, by the way, the more Islamic one, which already saying in public, we are ready to get into a coalition with whatever government in Israel, may indicate that we are in for big changes about the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And that might be a good subject for Luis to write his next book, because Luis is a great writer. And my very last point is, guys, you have no idea what toxic environment exists today in the academic world about books like Luis. He's going to be clobbered in reviews by all kinds of people because he didn't write a book in order to vilify Israel and portray the Israelis as God knows what. So Luis is a very brave person, but on top of that, he's also a great writer. And thank you very much to all. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank
The
you.
pressure of the wife is there, and I have to leave.
No, we won't be.
I
Shalom,
appreciate.
Thank you.
we
Thank
won't
you,
be-
Okay, don't put it on her, she says.
Yossi, thank you so much, Yossi. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are honored to have so many esteemed people online today. I see Ken Stein. Ken Stein is a professor of contemporary Middle Eastern history, political science, and Israeli studies at Emory. And he's also the founder of the Center for Israel Education. He made a comment here. He posted a comment. If you don't mind, Ken, I'll just read it quickly. It's very important. Concepts and conclusions to offer. One, what is the most important objective for the PA and the PLO or Hamas? The answer to each is the same: stay in power, have access to foreign funding, deny any new Palestinian coalition of forces an opportunity to rule or govern. Actions by all of them since 1993 affirm that reality. Second, the PLO started as a liberation movement. It tried to use the Oslo framework as a means to cover the reality that the PLO was changing its stripes, but Arafat was not capable of dropping the AK-47 from his grasp. The PLO today in 2021 has not yet transformed itself into a pluralistic organization where it can accept a viable opposition. Third, the effort to find a solution between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs since 2010 is of greater interest by external interests, Europeans, US, UN, Russians, and not by the main parties to the conflict itself. In the last 5 Israeli elections, resolving the P1 conflict has not been a priority to the Israeli electorate. So thank you for those comments, Ken. Very much appreciate it. We're running near the end, and I really did want to acknowledge some people who are here tonight. One being Ken Stein, which I did. Second, Sean Foreman, who's the chair of the political science department at Barry University in Miami. Moti Inbari, professor of religion at the University of North Carolina. And I saw here Lawrence Milstein, who's the Palm Beach County Regional Director for the American Jewish Committee. And I want to acknowledge our board members. The one I may miss some, but Dr. Jerry Spunberg, Michael Landau, Lou Solomon, and Dr. Linda Geller Schwartz. I wanted to get that out, but and I wish we had time for more comments, more to answer.
If you want me to answer some of the questions that are on the chat,
Luis, if you can take a look at the comments, group them together, and answer them in 5 minutes.
I'm just looking at it, and Ken, thank you so much for your comments. One thing with respect to Ken, I believe that in order to have a pluralistic society, you also have to have a strong structure. So that means you cannot have democracy in a weak state. Democracy in a weak state may eventually end up in anarchy. And so, yes, I think they should have been, I think the PLO should have been more pluralistic from the beginning, particularly knowing that they were alienated from the population in the West Bank, right? But they didn't do it. That's correct. So I agree with Ken 100%. Now, Samuel Feldberg is asking me if Israel can maintain the status quo. If not, how to deal with Hamas. Well, the status quo is the only thing we know. I don't think it can deal with it forever, because I frankly view the war of propaganda as being very important. And I write in my book also about the importance of the international community, particularly the Europeans. When you have the Europeans abstaining on a strong, condemnation of Israel, or when you see the Europeans voting in UNESCO, to remove, to rename the Temple Mount, which is what happened, you see that, you theoretically you can maintain the status quo. I think in the long run you can't. I think you are going to leave the Palestinian problem alive. It is going to have a cause for isolation of Israel, for propaganda against Israel, and obviously for mobilization of Palestinians. So I'd rather not seeing the status quo at this point going on, although I spoke to several people in Israel, particularly from the security establishment, that they told me that the status quo is the best thing we can get now. I am not sure I agree in the long run. Now, Michael Skoll is asking me, about the Abraham Accords. Yes, the Abraham Accords are definitely one of the greatest achievements of the Trump administration. I believe that those who deserve the Nobel Peace Prize at this point, I believe it is, are the leaders of Israel and the Arab world for achieving the Abraham Accords. And I think the Trump administration helped with that. Jared Kushner and even President Trump. It's not up to me to decide who should get the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, you know, the issue of Nobel Prizes is so complicated. You know, remember the president of Myanmar at one point received the Nobel Prize, and then you had cases of horrible genocide and ethnic cleansing. So I wouldn't gamble on anybody on the Nobel Prize. There was another question, I believe. Eduardo Molina is saying, what are the possibilities to settle the conflict? Well, I explained that. You know, the main problem is, you know, the inability of the Palestinians to negotiate anything because they don't have control over the population. They don't have monopoly over the means of violence, as Max Weber pointed out. And as a result, they are unable to settle the conflict. This is why I talk about settling the conflict through the Arab world. You know, a Jordanian-Palestinian confederacy or a union between Gaza and Egypt guaranteed by the Arab world.
Okay. Luis, let me bring it to a close.
Yes.
I'd like to thank Robert Rubio and Luis Fleischman for the wonderful interaction, the questions, the answers, making us smarter on the subject. I'm fortunate to know both of these gentlemen, and I'm a business partner here in this organization with Luis, so I get to hear his genius all the time. So thank you, Luis. I also want to thank everyone who came. We wouldn't be an organization without people coming to our events. We are a 501c3, so please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org and take a look at the articles. If you like what you see, you can always click on the donation button. And with that, I again thank everyone for coming, and I thank Luis and Robert and Yossi for their participation, of course, and have a wonderful evening. And for those who celebrate, Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you, Louis. And Mazal Tov again, my friend. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And honey, I'll be home soon.
Thank you.
Bye.